Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today we're going to be looking at red flags in relationships. But you know the source we're looking at today. It's called Unkind. And it makes this kind of surprising argument that the biggest red flag might not be what you think. Like it's not always the super obvious stuff like cheating or huge blowouts. Instead, they say that one of the most damaging but often overlooked red flags is actually unkindness. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's interesting because the source really digs into how this seemingly small thing, this unkindness, can be so destructive in a relationship over time. It's like a slow poison that just gradually eats away at your self-worth and the whole foundation of the relationship.
Yeah, we always hear about those big dramatic red flags,
Yeah.
the lying, the cheating, but unkindness, that's not something you normally think of as a deal breaker, right?
Yeah.
So how does the source even define unkindness? Like, what are we talking about here?
So the source is careful to point out that it's not about just like isolated incidents or occasional slip-ups. I mean, we all have bad days, right? It's about a consistent pattern of behavior that makes the other person feel small or disrespected or just unimportant. The source actually gives this helpful checklist of behaviors that when they happen over and over again, they can indicate this pattern of unkindness. Things like dismissive comments, backhanded compliments, jokes that are at your expense, ignoring your feelings, and constantly interrupting you.
So it sounds like it's not necessarily about these huge blowups, but more about the accumulation of these little acts of unkindness that can be more harmful over time.
Yeah, exactly. And what the source is saying is that if you can learn to spot these subtle signs early on, it can save you years of heartache and protect your self-worth in the long run.
That makes a lot of sense. But it brings up another question for me. How much of this unkindness is actually intentional? Like, are we talking about people who are deliberately trying to hurt their partners? Or can it be unintentional?
That's a really good question. And the source does acknowledge that sometimes unkindness can come from a place of ignorance or just a lack of self-awareness. But even when it's unintentional, it can still be really hurtful. And it's important to address it no matter what the intention is. What's interesting is that the source points out how often this unkindness can be disguised as humor or sarcasm.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The just getting defense.
Yeah.
I think we've all been on the receiving end of those jokes that sting a little, even if the person insists they didn't mean anything by it.
Exactly. And the source is really trying to emphasize that you shouldn't have to downplay your feelings or convince yourself that it's okay just because someone says they were joking. If it hurts consistently, that's a problem.
So it's about trusting your gut
Yeah.
and recognizing that your feelings are valid. You don't have to just laugh something off to avoid awkwardness.
Right. And on top of that, the source also warns against gaslighting, which is where the unkind person manipulates you into believing that you're overreacting, which can just further erode your confidence.
Wow, that's a whole other level. So it's not just about spotting unkindness itself, but also being aware of these tactics that are used to invalidate your feelings and make you question your own perceptions.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so crucial to understand the psychological impact of this unkindness. When you're constantly exposed to that kind of negativity, it can make you feel like you're walking on eggshells all the time, like you're always afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing and triggering another unkind remark.
And over time, that can really take a toll on your self-esteem and your sense of security in the relationship. It's like you start to shrink yourself to try to avoid upsetting the other person.
Exactly. And the source really emphasizes that this is not how a healthy relationship should feel. You deserve to feel safe, respected, and loved. You shouldn't have to constantly censor yourself or downplay your feelings to avoid conflict.
So if you're in a relationship where you feel like you're walking on eggshells, always second-guessing yourself, or feeling like you're not being heard or respected, those are some pretty big red flags that you need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. The source makes a really compelling case for why even small acts of unkindness can have this corrosive effect on your well-being and the long-term health of the relationship. And it's so important to remember that you have the right to demand better.
I think that's a really powerful message. We've talked a lot about the negative impacts of unkindness, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the flip side. What does kindness actually look like in a healthy relationship?
That's a great question. The source suggests that true kindness in a relationship goes beyond just not being hurtful. It's about making a conscious effort to make the other person feel seen, heard, and valued.
So it's not just about what you don't do, but also about the positive actions you take to create a supportive and loving environment.
Exactly. It's about celebrating each other's successes, offering comfort during tough times, and just consistently showing up for each other with empathy and understanding.
That really resonates with me. It's about creating a space where both partners feel safe to be themselves, express their feelings openly, and know that they'll be met with compassion and support.
You got it. And the source makes this great point. This kind of genuine kindness fosters mutual respect. And it strengthens the foundation of the relationship. It creates an environment where both partners can thrive and grow together.
So we've established that unkindness can be insidious, even disguised as humor. But how do we actually spot these red flags in real-life situations? Let's dive into some examples from the source.
So we're starting to get a better sense of what this unkindness looks like, in a relationship. But sometimes these behaviors can be pretty subtle, almost like they're hiding in plain sight. So how do we get better at recognizing those red flags before they turn into big problems?
Well, the source really stresses the importance of paying attention to your own feelings. It encourages you to ask yourself, how does this person make me feel consistently? Do I feel uplifted and supported? Or do I often feel drained or belittled or just disrespected after interacting with them? So it's not just about like analyzing their words or actions, but also really tuning into your own emotional response. So if you consistently feel like a knot in your stomach or a sense of unease after spending time with this person, that's a sign that something might be off.
Exactly. And the source is really clear that your feelings are valid, even if the other person tries to dismiss them or tell you that you're being too sensitive. You have the right to feel safe and respected in a relationship.
This reminds me of when the source talks about backhanded compliments. Like I remember this one time my aunt told me, "You look so much better when you wear makeup."
Mm.
And I kind of laughed it off at the time.
No.
But it definitely made me feel self-conscious about my appearance.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how unkindness can be disguised as a compliment or even a joke. And the source goes on to give a bunch of other examples to help you spot these subtle red flags. Like, think about those times when someone constantly interrupts you, or talks over you, or dismisses your opinions as unimportant.
Right. Or what about those jokes that always seem to target your insecurities, even though the person says they're just teasing?
Yeah, exactly. And the source suggests this really practical exercise. Like, think of a recent interaction where you felt that pang of unkindness, and then analyze it. Was it a direct attack or was it more of a disguised jab? And doing that can help you train your unkindness radar for future situations.
I like that. Train your unkindness radar. So it's about being more mindful of the dynamics in your relationships and paying attention to those subtle cues that might be pointing to a pattern of unkindness.
Precisely. And recognizing those red flags is the first step towards protecting yourself and setting healthy boundaries.
Okay, so let's talk about boundaries then. What role do they play in all of this? Like, how do boundaries help us navigate unkindness in a relationship?
Well, the source is very clear that setting boundaries is absolutely crucial when it comes to dealing with unkindness. It's about communicating your needs and expectations to the other person, clearly and firmly, and letting them know that certain behaviors are just not acceptable.
I mean, that takes courage though, right? Especially if you're not used to asserting yourself
Mm.
or if you're worried about causing conflict.
Oh, absolutely. It's not always easy. But the source reminds us that setting boundaries is not about being controlling or demanding. It's about taking care of yourself and protecting your own emotional well-being.
It's like drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is where my self-respect begins.
Exactly. And the source gives some really practical tips for how to set boundaries effectively. It emphasizes the importance of being clear, concise, and assertive in your communication.
So instead of saying something like, you always make me feel bad, you might say, when you make comments about my weight, it makes me feel uncomfortable and disrespected. Please stop doing that.
Yeah, that's a great example. The source really stresses the importance of focusing on the behavior and its impact on you, rather than attacking the other person's character.
But then what happens if the other person just refuses to acknowledge their behavior or tries to gaslight you into thinking that you're the problem?
That's a really important point, and it can be a super difficult situation to navigate. But the source reminds us that you are not responsible for the other person's reactions. You have the right to set boundaries, and you don't need their permission to do so.
So it's not about getting them to agree with you or change their behavior overnight. It's about asserting your own needs and standing firm in your decision to protect yourself.
Precisely. And the source also cautions against getting caught up in these long debates or trying to convince the other person why they're wrong. Sometimes the best approach is to just state your boundary clearly and then disengage from the conversation if they get defensive or argumentative.
You can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. Sometimes it's more about protecting your own peace than trying to change someone else's mind.
Absolutely. And the source emphasizes that this isn't about giving the other person a free pass to be unkind. It's about recognizing that you can only control your own actions and reactions.
So setting boundaries is really about empowering yourself to take control of your own well-being in the relationship. It's about choosing to no longer tolerate behavior that makes you feel disrespected or diminished.
You got it. And the source reminds us that this can be a process. It might take time to learn how to set boundaries effectively and to feel comfortable asserting yourself.
Yeah, it's like building a muscle. The more you practice setting boundaries,
Ah,
the stronger and more confident you'll become in protecting yourself from unkindness.
exactly. And the source also encourages you to seek support if you're struggling with this process. Talking to a therapist, a counselor, or even a trusted friend or family member can provide valuable guidance and encouragement as you navigate these challenges.
Okay, so we've talked about recognizing unkindness and setting boundaries.
Mm.
But what happens when those boundaries are repeatedly crossed? Like, what does the source say about dealing with persistent unkindness in a relationship?
Well, the source acknowledges that this is a really tough situation to be in, and often heartbreaking. It stresses the importance of prioritizing your own well-being and recognizing that you deserve to be in a relationship where you feel loved, respected, and valued.
So it's not about trying to fix the other person
Yeah,
or hoping that they'll magically change. It's about recognizing that you have the power to choose what you're willing to tolerate.
exactly. And the source makes it clear that sometimes the healthiest and most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from a relationship that is consistently unkind, even if it's painful to do so.
That's a really tough message,
Yeah.
but it's also a powerful one. It's about recognizing that you deserve to be in a relationship that nourishes your soul,
Mm-hmm.
not one that constantly chips away at your self-esteem.
Absolutely. And the source reminds us that this decision doesn't diminish the love you may have for the other person. It simply means that you're prioritizing your own well-being and choosing to create a life filled with kindness, respect, and joy.
This has been such an insightful conversation so far. We've explored the nuances of unkindness, how to recognize those subtle red flags, the importance of setting boundaries, and even the difficult decision of walking away when a relationship is consistently harmful. But the source doesn't just leave us with a sense of doom and gloom. It also offers some really empowering advice on how to cultivate kindness in our own lives and relationships.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's a crucial part of this conversation. It's not just about avoiding unkindness, but also about actively choosing to be kind to ourselves and others. And let's explore what the source has to say about that.
Okay, so we've spent a good chunk of time kind of digging into the darker side of relationships, the red flags, the unkindness, the boundaries. But I really appreciate that this source doesn't just leave us feeling all doom and gloom. It ends on this really positive note. By shifting the focus to actually cultivating kindness.
Yeah, right? It's like a breath of fresh air. And the source makes this really important point that kindness isn't just this passive thing, it's an active choice. It's like a muscle we can strengthen, both in how we treat ourselves and how we interact with others.
That makes me wonder. The source focuses mostly on romantic relationships. But how much of this applies to all the other connections in our lives? Like, what about friendships, family, colleagues? Surely kindness is important there too, right?
Oh, absolutely. The source touches on this a bit and basically says that the same principles apply. Recognizing and addressing unkindness is important in any relationship. Romantic relationships might have higher stakes sometimes, but the core message is the same. We deserve kindness in all our relationships, and we have the power to cultivate it.
This actually reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about recognizing unkindness regardless of intent. I feel like that's even more important outside of romantic relationships. Like sometimes a friend might make a thoughtless comment without even realizing how hurtful it is.
For sure. And the source actually gives us a framework for navigating these situations. It suggests starting by assuming good intent, instead of jumping to conclusions and assuming the worst. Give the person the benefit of the doubt and gently address the issue. You could say something like, "Hey, when you said X, it actually made me feel Y. I know you probably didn't mean it that way, but I just wanted to let you know."
Yeah, I like that. It opens up a space for communication without putting the other person immediately on the defensive. It's like that saying, assume good intentions, but hold people accountable for their actions.
Exactly. And the source makes it clear that holding people accountable doesn't always have to be this big dramatic thing. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply choose not to engage with the unkindness.
So it's about recognizing that we have a choice. We can choose to surround ourselves with people who lift us up and treat us with kindness. And we can choose to distance ourselves from those who consistently bring us down.
Exactly. And that brings us back to what the source says about self-kindness. It argues that we can't truly cultivate kindness in our relationships with others unless we're first kind to ourselves.
Okay, I love this. But what does being kind to yourself actually look like in practice? Is it all bubble baths and affirmations? Or is there something more to it?
Well, the source takes a more down-to-earth approach. It's about treating yourself with the same compassion, understanding, and respect that you would offer to a close friend. It's about acknowledging your strengths, accepting your flaws, and celebrating your unique journey.
So it's about quieting that inner critic, that voice that's always telling us we're not good enough or smart enough or successful enough.
Exactly. And the source argues that that kind of negative self-talk can be just as damaging as any external unkindness. It eats away at our confidence, and it prevents us from living our lives to the fullest.
That makes a lot of sense. If we're
Yeah.
constantly beating ourselves up, it's hard to believe that we deserve kindness from anyone else.
Right.
But if we can learn to treat ourselves with compassion and grace, we set the standard for how we expect others to treat us.
You got it. And the source suggests that this self-kindness creates a ripple effect. When we model kindness towards ourselves, it inspires others to do the same. It creates a more positive and compassionate world, one interaction at a time.
I love that. This deep dive has been such a powerful reminder that kindness isn't a weakness, it's a superpower. It's a choice we can make every single day to create more fulfilling relationships and a more meaningful life. So as we wrap up, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is this. You are worthy of kindness. Full stop. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise.
That's a beautiful message. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey of exploring kindness and its incredible power to transform our lives. Until next time, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and remember, you are capable of creating amazing things.